Take care.
Please welcome to the stage Dan Glickman, former Secretary of Agriculture and Congressional Program Executive Director of the Aspen Institute, Clyde Prestowitz, President of the Economic Strategy Institute, and Lori Wallach, Director and Founder of Global Trade Watch. Here to moderate our final conversation of the day is the Atlantic's Steve Clemons.
Sit. Great. Have a seat. Clyde, Lori, Dan, thank you very much for joining us. I'm sure, I'm going to buy them all a drink right after this. Maker's Mark is sponsoring our reception, so we were able to maintain a great audience for you. It's been a hell of a day. And I just think that trade has come back as this amazingly powerful, significant issue. I'm going to just confide something that perhaps, reading a piece by Dan Glickman, that essentially starts out worrying that people are forgetting some of the basic positive connections. Lori, you were just in Germany. You look great for having all the jet lag and all that, and protesting out there. Clyde, I know that this is something you've been carrying and thinking about for decades. But has it surprised you, Clyde, that the battles you had in the 1980s and 1990s are finally getting a hearing?
I would say yes and no, Steve. I mean, I always felt that there were things that were wrong that weren't being addressed. I didn't expect that it would suddenly pop up in this election, and interestingly, both on the right and on the left. So it's a bit of a surprise in that sense.
I just want to share with the audience, Clyde Prestowitz may be the most failed bureaucrat in the history of government. He often told this story. It was Malcolm Baldrige you worked for, right? Yeah. And he came in, I guess we had a $2 billion trade deficit, and Malcolm said, I need you to get this down. I think we're going to do a deal, I can get a kickback.
It was $25 billion annually,
yeah.
And half of it was with Japan. And I asked Mac what my job was, and he said, you got to reduce the trade deficit. So I asked how much I'd get paid. And he gave me some number I've forgotten, but it was less than my kids and wife had become accustomed to. So Baldwin said, now he's a business guy. He understood entrepreneurial spirit, so he'd pay me a bonus, 5% of the amount by which I reduced the trade deficit. So 5 years later, I owed him $60 billion. Here I am.
Let me jump to Dan here for a minute. Dan, you are worried as well about the time that we're in. Well, give us the quick frame of the Dan Glickman take on trade.
First of all, I've met the Maker's Mark people in Kentucky. They're great people. So you're glad to have them as a sponsor. I hope to benefit from this.
Yeah, you will.
I've got a nuanced view on this. I'm a pro-trade guy. Agriculture generally benefits from trade. But for the life of me, I can't understand why the politicians of this country don't recognize that there are tens of millions of people in this country who have this high anxiety, this fear of losing their jobs, not seeing their wages go up, and somehow haven't figured out that one way to make America more competitive is to have a robust infrastructure program on sewer systems, water systems, roads, highways, bridges, ports, airports, seaports, electric grids, which could put millions of people to work at the kind of high-paying jobs that are being lost, many of them, by globalization. It seems to me that this is not that difficult a political issue. America gains by being engaged in the world. America engaged by being part of the world, and trading is part of that practice. But most Americans are fearful of their jobs and their economic status now, and they look outside and they don't see any benefits from this. The benefit you hear is that in the long term, this will work out great. But I think it was John Maynard Keynes said that only the long term, we're all dead. And most people are really worried about their lives. So if they could see outside, rebuilding the country. We got 1,000 cities like Flint, Michigan that are in the same predicament. We got roads, sewers, bridges, water systems. I just came back from China, and I could see what a country has done to rebuild its infrastructure, at least partially. So if we could politically tie trade, which is important to America's competitiveness, to rebuilding the country, I don't want to sound like Donald Trump because I'm not a supporter of Trump. But on this one, he's kind of right. We got to rebuild our country. And if you do that, then you
Sounds like you're leaving the door open.
No, I'm for Hillary.
Yeah,
and
okay.
I'm going to try to impress upon her to do this kind of thing. But if we do this right, you can create a lot of trust that government works for them. They can see that. And that has just been outside of this debate, and it just absolutely amazes me that nobody's tied these issues together.
One of the things we tried to do for this conference was to get the president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the head of the AFL-CIO both up here on stage, and they wanted to do it. They were traveling today, and they both so strongly agree with the message on infrastructure. It begs the question of who's the enemy? Who's against what you just suggested?
Well, the enemy is nobody wants to come up with the revenues to pay for any of this stuff. It's no secret. And so we either have to raise the gas tax or repatriate money from overseas or establish a national infrastructure bank. The real enemy is leadership. We saw that leadership during the FDR years. We saw the leadership during Eisenhower years when we built the interstate highway system. Virtually all these jobs are private sector jobs with some public sector help. But it requires the leadership, and most Americans support these kinds of infrastructure projects. So I'm just saying somebody ought to tie these things together. Maybe we could get both of these things done.
Lori, you're just back from Germany, and I was looking at public attitudes in Germany. The support for trade there is actually lower than those who support trade agendas in the United States, which I just didn't know or realize. And let me make this tough for you. What would a Lori Wallach supported trade agreement look like?
The best.
Have you ever supported one?
We have worked on a bunch of bills and alternative trade agreements that didn't get any legs politically, but I think the best.
But there is hypothetically a Lori Wallach trade agreement.
Well, we busted our butts through 2009, getting 150 co-sponsors on a piece of legislation called the Trade Reform, Accountability, Democracy, and Employment Act. And that was 90 pages of detail of exactly what a good trade agreement would look like. And it's basically like a replacement of Fast Track that is a more democratic, open system for delegating authority. But then, 80% of the bill is the substance of the negotiating objectives of what must or must never be in a good trade agreement. And it was something, actually, it wasn't just my view of it. It was an iterative process that involved about 100 civil society groups, scholars, trade lawyers, and was very broadly supported. It had Democratic and Republican co-sponsors in the House and the Senate. And it basically was the model of how you could harvest expanded trade without all the baggage. I mean, what we've got now in the US is we have a process for trade policy making that harkens back to the period when trade agreements were basically about tariff cutting and opening quotas. The problem is, you take an agreement like TPP or TTIP, TPP, the text is out, 30 chapters. 5 of them actually have to do with traditional trade. 26 chapters full of domestic policy issues, or issues we would have thought as domestic policy issues, copyrights, patents, food safety standards, land use issues. And these were set through the closed-door processes that probably were appropriate to insulate protected industries from being able to blow up cutting tariffs to help consumers. Except it's not just about those tariff border tax issues. It's rewriting major swaths of policies that will affect everyone's day-to-day lives. And when you ask about what's up with Germany, it's what your previous guest just said. People there have their hair on fire with the notion of a trade agreement telling them what they can and cannot do as far as food labeling, chemical regulation, climate policy, consumer data privacy. I mean, as a consumer group, that when the TTIP negotiations started, we laid out what we were for, because we kind of thought, prayed, hoped this would break the old US trade agreement model. So what we wanted basically is a floor of standards everyone had to meet as compared to the US model, which is a ceiling. And you go higher, it's a trade barrier. So what we have is the ceiling model. So every place Europe was stronger in their consumer regs, which we thought we could hijack a ride up on, they get pushed down. And there are a few areas we're stronger. Our FDA medicine approval system, better than what they have in Europe. We have a precautionary principle system like Europe has on food.
Right.
Our system on financial regulation is actually stronger than theirs post-crisis. So those were areas where we can get dragged down. And here's what's heartbreaking about your infrastructure idea, which I totally support. In TPP and pushed for TTIP is a requirement that we actually waive the Buy America rules that would make an amplification of that investment, not just on the service contracts, but on all the infrastructure hard pieces, so that we create a demand for instance, technology investment in new, efficient, energy-efficient production, et cetera. have to basically offshore our tax dollars as well as this private sector investment. And that issue is another of the issues that has people
Thank you. Let me ask
wound up.
Clyde. Clyde, last night we were at dinner, and you made, I think, a very powerful point that we're really not, Americans really aren't anti-trade or pro-trade, that trade's really not the game. It's a marker for quality of life, frustration, inequality, all of this other stuff. And I'd love you to take us there, because I found it a very human framing of what we're talking about. And just, again, I just heard Donald Trump speak in town today. And while there were a lot of internal inconsistencies in his speech, it did sound to me like he'd read your book. And so I'm interested in whether Donald Trump is resonating with you, or you think he's piped into something you've said. So take us, why is trade the wrong marker?
Well, I think when you ask somebody, are you for trade, it's kind of like asking, are you for motherhood? I don't think anybody's against trade. The question is, what kind of trade? Typically in the U.S., the issue has been, are you a free trader? Theodore Roosevelt famously said in a letter in 1903, thank God I am not a free trader. Abraham Lincoln, we call him the great emancipator. He could be called the great protector. He raised tariffs higher than any other president. So the issue is what kind of trade, and then I would just take a step beyond that and say that we're not talking trade these days. As Lori pointed out, we're talking globalization.
Right.
And Bob Lawrence at Harvard had a good characterization of this some years ago when he made a distinction between what typically, traditionally, had been called free trade, getting rid of tariffs and quotas, border measures, and deep integration. Deep integration being the food labeling and the FDA, the pharmaceutical contents and so forth are also being ruled upon. So what globalization is about is pretty deep integration, and particularly investment. And I want to underline the investment thing because, you know, behind all of our policy and discussion of what we call free trade is David Ricardo, the concept of comparative advantage, and Ricardo developed that comparative advantage concept in the context of trade, and he specifically says in the following chapter that he wrote in 1817, of course, if there were cross-investment, this would not work. So we are actually living in a world in which investment flows are as important, if not more important, than trade flows. And that changes the game dramatically. And so when you look at the question then of globalization, let's go back to the late 1990s, at the time that we were discussing China joining the World Trade Organization. And there was a kind of a mantra that was repeated, which went something like, globalization will make countries rich. Being rich, they'll become democratic. Being democratic, they'll be peace-loving because, quote, we know that democracies don't go to war with each other. And I think that in that context, forecasts were made. I remember at the time the Congress was voting on China, on what we called it the most favored nation is what I remember, but they
PNTR.
PNTR.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, you know, the trade representative at the time, head of the Council of Economic Advisors, all of these top people in the U.S. government, plus all the models. You know, all of the think tanks had models, and virtually all the models and all the think tanks and all the experts predicted that the then $80 billion U.S. trade deficit with China would be reduced because China had far more barriers to our imports than we had to theirs. Well, in the wake of China coming in and the experience of the last 16 years, people realized, whoa, that didn't work. The trade deficit is now $400 billion with China, and all the models and all the projections were really wrong. And so I think that lies behind a lot of the unhappiness that we're seeing. Let me just close with one last point, which is that if you look at the structure of the world economy, the United States plays two primary roles in the world economy, and they're self-assigned roles. The first one is that we are the provider of security. And the second one is we are the buyer of last resort. And those two essentially work together to inevitably give us a permanent current account deficit, which we can sustain as long as the dollar remains the world's major reserve currency. We borrow in our own currency, and as long as the Chinese and the Japanese and other big dollar holders invest in treasuries and reinvest in the US, hey, it's a party. And the question is it a permanent party? Or at some point, will the Chinese actually succeed in making the RMB a real reserve currency?
What's your bet?
I think it'll be a long time. I mean, if you look at what's happening in China politically today, it suggests that, to me, it suggests it'll be a long time. On the other hand, nothing lasts forever. And so when, if and when the dollar, there's an alternative to the dollar, then this whole structure will change. But if we want to get, and I want to respond a little bit to Dan, because what the structure means is effectively that we consume more than we produce. And that ultimately reduces our productive capacity. Our ability, our wealth creating capacity is constantly being eroded because of this structure in which we consume and borrow, and the rest of the world produces and lends.
Okay, Dan's hair's on fire.
Okay. First of all, are there any other former elected congressmen in this room besides me? Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about the political aspects of this. I was a congressman from 18 years from Kansas. I voted for NAFTA in 1994, and as I was telling Lori, I lost that year, part of the Gingrich Revolution, in part because of NAFTA, in part because of my position on guns, and in part because of my position in support of the Clinton health care package. Notwithstanding that, I think that for America to disengage in the world, in the world trading system, is a terrible mistake. It weakens us. It makes us a second-rate power. And I just came back from on an Aspen trip from China with 20 members of Congress, and and we met with people from all over Southeast Asia and East Asia. And as a concept, I'm not arguing maybe that you have some points on some of the trade agreements, but as a concept, for us to just withdraw is just stupid. I'm just telling you that, my friends. What I'm talking about is that the people who are for trade agreements, the kind of elitism that goes with this, which is it's good for you. Don't go into the details, because it's going to be fine for big companies and it's going to be good for workers. The fact of the matter is that there isn't much trust in our government now. There's not much trust in our institutions and in any, except maybe the military. So my dad used to tell me that the great thing about the Depression is that during that time, people walked out and they saw people working. And some of it was make work, I understand that. But the confidence that a national program to rebuild our water and sewer systems, when I saw what happened to Flint, Michigan, I'm told that virtually every major city in the country has that problem. I'm thinking to myself, why can't we be smart and realize that trade agreements will have great difficulty passing the Congress because of experiences like mine, and at the same time find a way to make people feel at home, that we can create millions of good-paying jobs, give people trust that their system works economically, and make us more competitive globally in the process.
Right.
That's, I guess, my pitch.
But before I go to Lori, and I want to ask each of you, we've only got a few minutes, and I want to get a couple of questions from the audience before I buy you a drink, Dan, from your former Kentucky folks. Donald Trump in his speech today said something along the lines of, we can't be seduced by the false song of globalism. Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders both came out against TPP. And I'm interested in whether or not we're just at a punctuation point and an inflection point where none of the leading candidates actually are advocates of the kind of trade agenda and international. I interviewed Jack Lew, the Secretary of Treasury, and he made exactly your same point. America cannot afford to disengage internationally. But I don't see any of the candidates. Lori, do you see any of the candidates as real robust supporters of the kind of international?
Kasich.
What's that?
Kasich. He's doing really well.
Yeah, John Kasich doing really well. Clyde? I mean, so I guess my question to you is, Clyde, and we'll just go real lightning round. What is is there a smart form of global engagement that you think is possible and doable that you would support?
Well, I think come back to the question of what's sustainable for the United States. And I think what Trump has put his finger on, and also Bernie Sanders, both of them have put their fingers on, is that the status quo is increasingly unsustainable in the sense that the U.S. does carry a much heavier security load than anybody else. I mean, to the tune of 2 or 3 times or 4 times more than any other major country. And at the same time, if you sit back and ask yourself the question, well, what is the threat to the United States? And actually, the countries that are paying less appear to be more on the front line of threat. And so that's an obvious discrepancy that both Bernie and Trump have pointed at. The other one is that when we ask, if I go to an audience like this and I say, how many people here are for free trade? Almost everybody raises their hand.
All right, how many people for free trade? All right.
See?
Yep.
Okay. If I say to you, are you for unilateral free trade? In other words, are you for trade in which the American market is open but the foreign market is not open? Are you for that kind of trade? Because if this room were full of economists, professional PhD economists, members of the American Economics Association, they would all raise their hand because they think one-way free trade is free trade. So the language, is very important, and what in effect has been happening is that for a variety of reasons, the global economy has become structured in such a way that the American market is the most open market, with a few small country exceptions. But the U.S. is the most open major market, and all of the other major markets have different degrees of difficulty.
Lori?
The choice is not between engagement versus not engage. I think you're right, we've hit an inflection point, and we did so out of volition, which is to say we had a moment when the Obama administration came in that they could have decided to take a different kind of model of our international commercial agreements based on what was already brewing opposition and political pushback. And instead they decided to double down. They inherited the beginning of Bush's TPP. They got done with it by rolling back the environmental standards Bush had put in his trade agreements, by giving more to the pharmaceutical industry than the Democrats in Congress had allowed Bush to get away with. They are pushing Europe to do basically a transatlantic NAFTA plus in the TTIP.
Right.
And that moment of trying to do that thing has created a moment where many people in the country say, I'd rather have nothing than TPP. But the choice is not TPP versus autarky. It is just one version, and at the heart of it, and this gets to sort of the investment issue, both the infrastructure investment, but the investment rules. At the heart of TPP and in TTIP are these rules that promote offshoring. So you have the Cato Institute, which likes TPP generally, which opposes these investor rules, Chapter 9, anyone who wants to look at USTR.gov, go take a look. And these rules actually, they basically subsidize offshoring by lowering the risk premium of going to a place you would never send your investment, your IP, et cetera. And so we've put the thumb in the scale of getting rid of our productive capacity through the rules. So right now, are we going to see those agreements done? I think we've hit an inflection point where we won't.
Right.
But could we have agreements that do keep us engaged, and in fact that more promote the goals and values that I think you would see a pretty broad consensus on, that I think are in that Trade Act I mentioned?
Am I feeling a Lori Wallach, Dan Glickman common bond
No,
here?
first of all, I appreciate Lori's opinion. I think she's wrong on a lot of specifics.
Okay.
But let me just make this point.
Yes.
The real problem here is the lack of trust that most people have in anything their major institutions say, especially what their government says. It's too bad. Can't run a society where nobody believes anything that comes out of their government. But so that's why I talk about me as an ex-politician, okay? What does a politician see about this? When they go home, they see a lot of people who are hurting, who are anxious, who are worried. So, you know, Senator Moynihan says you can sure have your opinions, but you can't have your facts. You can sure have your opinions, but you can't have the facts. The fact of the matter is that right now, nobody believes anything. Good trade agreements, and I think Mike Froman has negotiated good trade agreements, but it doesn't matter because nobody believes them out there, whatever they say. And that's why I say politically these things won't fly unless there's a quid pro quo that gives people something to trust their government in.
So, great.
Can I
We're
add
right.
one thing?
Yeah, go ahead, Clyde.
The reason nobody believes it is because when these deals are presented, they're always presented as, if we do this deal, it's going to increase U.S. GDP by $200 billion or $300 billion within 5 or 10 years, and it never does.
So with that, let me take 2 or 3 quick, very fast questions. If you have more than one question, I'm going to cut you off. But Mitzi, we'll go right here. So there, and guys will all have questions at drinks. How's that? Mitzi Wertheim right here, really fast. We get the microphone to you because millions of people are watching online. But Mitzi, 30 seconds.
Mitzi Wertheim of the Naval Postgraduate School. Secretary, would you please write what you said for The Atlantic? We all need to hear it. The cover story of Atlantic right now is getting coverage in magazines all over the country, so we need you to stay. I wanted to stand up and cheer.
Okay.
Thank you.
So
Thank
number
you,
one, let's go right here. And we're going to just couple all these together. Yeah.
My name is Maka Taylor. I'm a current resident of Washington, D.C., and I would like to thank you, Senator Glickman, for your statement. And in saying that, we have to give the people belief, especially for those who are typically disenfranchised, marginalized. What would you suggest for your government and your fellow politicians?
Thank you. And then Pat Malloy.
I was on the China Commission for 10 years. This is for Secretary Glickman.
Can we have like some for Lori and Clyde?
They can split.
Yeah.
There's Warren Buffett wrote an article in Fortune magazine in October 2003 entitled "The Trade Deficit is going to sell the country out from under us." The theory is when you're sending your dollars abroad to buy their goods and they're not sending them back to buy your goods, they accumulate the dollars. And then they can come and buy political influence by buying industries in your country. Is that something that we should be worried about? In fact, when we're running a trade deficit of 360 or 400 billion with China and seeing increasing Chinese investment coming into this country.
So I know there were tons of questions. My friend in the back, let's do it over drinks, and we'll come in. But let's take on all 3 of those questions.
Okay,
and I'm
first
going to
of
ask all 3 of you to
let-
respond.
Let's be honest. These trade agreements are not heaven on earth.
Right.
And people who sell them as nirvana, is we're going to change the world overnight. That's not true either. So I'm not arguing for that position. I just think it's better for the United States to do this than not better. How do you do? The question was asked about trust. It's leadership. It's leaders being honest with their people and offering bold solutions. One quick thing. The Union Station was built by a man named Daniel Burnham. Remember, he built the Wrigley Building in Chicago, the Tribune Building, and he said, "Make no little plans, for they do not have the power to stir men's souls." It's a great quote. And so our leaders have to talk big thoughts, big things, and be honest with people. And one of the problems on the trade agreement is both sides aren't very honest with each other.
Fascinating. Lori?
I think that I want to answer the question about sort of what is it that people can do to inspire politicians do to inspire confidence. And I think to some degree, this is sort of the flip question of how the heck for instance, Trump is taking off the way he is, kind of behaving the way he is, that would normally make people think, what? And there's some way in which there's been so much, I think the trade issue becomes a concrete way of expressing it. There's been so much smoke blown around about the great benefits and so much hope for farmers, for workers, that issue has become a pinpoint for alienation, where people have heard so many lies about it compared to their actual experience, that one of the things that could fix it would be programs that actually deliver on the things that actually people kept getting promised over and over. So certainly one of those is infrastructure investment, but also would be really a trade policy that would have a different set of rules that were focused on using our leverage to actually achieve things that were delivering benefits to more people. So, it pains me also listening to Trump and thinking that actually made sense. But the thing that he says is, part of what we need is to negotiate differently. And I don't think the issue is the cast of characters per se, but it's what we decide to have as it's our way or the highway thing. Well, right now, that's intellectual property. You all can just go to hell, we're not doing this agreement unless you agree for these extended copyrights, these extended patents. But imagine, for instance, if that were about, you have to have X reciprocal market access to deal with trade deficits. You have to have currency, disciplines against currency devaluations and cheating, so you can't get rid of cutting your tariffs through a devaluation. So our market access is on paper, and then poof, it's gone. We don't make those kind of conditions that would actually create more jobs for more people. And that is something that I think if we're flipped, you could start to build confidence again in expanded trade, as well as other policies.
Clyde?
So let me follow on with Lori, because Dan and the young lady here talked about recreating trust. Well, the way to recreate trust is to tell the truth. And let me just give you a quick, the fundamental dishonesty here is, with regard to TPP, is that it's about trade. It's not about trade. I was invited to the White House along with several other think tank type people in 2009 when TPP was just being discussed. At that time, Japan wasn't in it, so it was going to be Canada, Mexico, the US, Peru, Chile, New Zealand, Australia, Brunei, Malaysia, Singapore, and the US. We already had free trade agreements with Mexico, Canada, Peru, Chile, Australia, and Singapore. So adding Brunei and Malaysia.
New Zealand.
And New Zealand. So I said, please, what's the point?
You have like these written on your fingers?
No,
or
I don't.
something?
No, it's clean.
No, yeah, okay.
But
It's
I said,
impressive.
what's the point? We're adding peanut, fly little economies. I said, well, actually, it's because our allies in Southeast Asia feel like we haven't been present. Some of our top leaders have missed meetings in Asia at the Asian summits. And so this is to reassure them that we're back, that America is back. And I said, my God, we have 50,000 troops in Okinawa, 38,000 troops in Korea. The 7th Fleet has been home ported in Yokosuka and patrolled the Western Pacific for the past 75 years. When did we leave? But when the president talks about TPP, what does he say? It's going to stop China. Somehow it's going to stop China. It won't stop China. All the countries that we're negotiating with are busily negotiating free trade deals with China. TPP is not going to do that. But in the president's head, somehow, and in the broader political foreign policy elite of the United States, there's this notion that TPP is going to reassure our allies in Asia, make them feel warm and cozy, that somehow we're offsetting China. And that's the truth. So if Mike Froman would stand up and say, folks, this is not really about trade, it's really about keeping Asia happy and safe, at least he'd be believed.
Let me just say before I thank this wonderful panel, I want to say a few words before we go out to our reception. I'm going to invite Margaret Lowe Smith up to say a few words as we close and enjoy some Maker's Mark cocktails, hopefully. My colleagues, Michael Bloom and Rob Hendon, and other people on our team at the Atlantic, and our partner, the Governor's Woods Foundation, Richard Vague, we designed this today, if you was a logic, to try to have a number of uncomfortable conversations, complicated conversations that looked across the broad array of perspectives, because the one thing that seems very clear is that the assumptions that we've been flying with almost all seem to need to be rethought, or at least taken through there. And so to Mitzi's point, Dan has written a piece, and we're taking a look at it, but it may end up in the Washington Post. We'll see. But, but I wanted to first, I think today has been such a wonderful day, because I think no one's pulled their punches. They've shared under one roof a very constructive conversation from a whole variety of things about private sector debt, about what's going on in Europe, about what the right social contract for Americans should be, what about inclusion and all these things. So I want to thank my former boss and good friend Clyde Prestowitz from the Economic Strategy Institute, Lori Wallach from Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, and Dan Glickman from all these other organizations, Bipartisan Policy Center, Aspen Institute, former Secretary. There aren't many titles you don't have. So Dan Glickman, the great Dan Glickman. But thank you all very, very much.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, great.